Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Yeah.
We are here to take those narratives that utterly dominated the global conversation, the ones layered with, sensational claims, years of investigation, and a final painful legal conclusion, and really extract the confirmed truth from all the surrounding noise.
Today, we are undertaking an extensive examination of a case that I think really redefined modern missing persons investigations and highlighted the devastating cost of elaborate deception. We're focused entirely on the 2016 disappearance, reappearance, and eventual legal reckoning of Sherri Papini.
Right. For so many people, that name, Sherri Papini, it instantly conjures this image of the supermom survivor, the face of a terrifying, a random abduction story. But as our source material reveals, the trajectory of this event moved pretty quickly from a shocking scenario of victimization to a legally confirmed case of deception and massive fraud.
And our mission here is to provide you with the full, verified chronology. We're going to move piece by piece, from the initial shock and the immediate claims she made, through the long, frustrating years of investigative inconsistencies, the forensic breakthroughs, and then finally, the serious legal and personal consequences that followed.
It's a necessary deep dive into how investigative patience and forensic science ultimately expose the truth, regardless of how convincing that initial lie might be.
Absolutely.
So let's get straight into the chronology, starting with the moment the world first heard her name, November 2016, and the frantic search for a missing wife and mother.
The initial incident was, on its face, just profoundly unsettling. It was Wednesday, November 2nd, 2016. Sherri Papini, 34 years old, was reported missing.
And she'd just been out for a run, right? A normal, everyday activity.
Exactly. She was out jogging in the area of Old Oregon Trail and Sunrise Drive in Redding, California, which was only about a mile from her home.
The immediate discovery made by her husband, Keith Papini, is what really turned this from what might have been, a simple missing adult report into a full-blown emergency.
It was. When he came home and realized she wasn't there, he used the Find My iPhone app.
Which is so clever. I mean, that's the first thing you do.
Right. And it led him to her phone and earbuds just there at a nearby rural intersection. That immediate evidence, the phone just abandoned mid-run, created this chilling narrative that suggested a rapid, forced interruption of her daily routine.
A violent interruption.
That was the immediate assumption. The location of the phone and the idea that she would never willingly abandon it, it just instantly catalyzed this massive emotional public response. People feared she had been violently snatched.
And that assumption, that initial fear, really shaped the next 3 weeks of what was an incredibly intense search.
It did. It involved the local Shasta County Sheriff's Office, the FBI, and literally hundreds of volunteers.
We're talking about an investigation that went global almost immediately. The media coverage was just relentless. There were fundraisers and massive reward money. I think it was reported to be around $50,000 was offered for her safe return.
All fueled by private donations, people just desperate to help find this seemingly innocent victim.
And this leads us to the most dramatic part of the story, her reappearance.
3 weeks after she disappeared, on Thanksgiving Day, November 24th, 2016, Papini was found. It was very early, around 4:30 a.m.
But the location detail here is so crucial. She wasn't found anywhere near Redding.
Not at all. She was located 150 miles south, right next to Interstate 5 in Yolo County, near the community of Woodland.
A massive distance.
A massive distance. And she was also reportedly still wearing restraints, specifically a waist chain and some zip ties.
The fact that she was found bound 150 miles away from where she vanished in the early hours of a national holiday, that provided powerful, visually distressing proof that an abduction had occurred.
It did. It immediately validated the weeks of public fear and all the police effort. It transformed her in the public eye from just a missing person into a survivor of a truly terrible ordeal.
So after this incredible trauma, what was the narrative she provided to the authorities? The Shasta County Sheriff Tom Bosenko specifically.
She presented a detailed, although as we now know, an entirely fabricated story. She claimed she had been held by 2 Hispanic women.
2 women. Not me.
2 women. She emphasized that they took considerable measures to conceal their faces and her identity, claiming they either wore masks or they kept her head covered most of the time. This was the foundation of the initial police profile: 2 armed Hispanic women driving a dark-colored SUV.
And the alleged physical abuse she suffered just added these harrowing details, cementing her public identity as a true crime victim.
Exactly. Her husband went public with some of these details, reinforcing the horror of her alleged captivity. He stated she had been physically beaten, her nose was reportedly broken, her hair was cut off.
Which is such a symbolic act of degradation.
It really is. And maybe the most startling detail was her weight had dropped to a skeletal 87 pounds, which is about 39 kilograms. These details were widely reported, drawing maximum public sympathy and, frankly, outrage.
But the physical detail that immediately puzzled investigators and the public alike was the branding. She claimed she had been branded on her right shoulder.
With the word Exodus.
Yep.
Later, she kind of refined this claim, suggesting it was meant to look like a verse from the biblical book of Exodus.
Why that specific word? What did that suggest to investigators?
Well, the word Exodus implies a deliberate crime, maybe something religiously or ideologically motivated, or at least a very specific message from her supposed captors. For investigators, this detail was a massive complication.
Right, because now you're not just looking for random criminals.
Exactly. They had to spend time chasing potential leads related to human trafficking, religious cults, or political extremist groups that might use that specific word. It was a detail designed to inject this deep, cryptic meaning into what was presented as a random, violent crime, something that's often absent in true random abductions.
And the resulting manhunt was just staggering in its scope. Law enforcement immediately put out alerts based on her description, searching for a dark-colored SUV with 2 Hispanic females armed with a handgun.
The sheer volume of resources dedicated to this search really cannot be overstated. Detectives ultimately authored nearly 20 search warrants.
So this wasn't just local police work.
No, not at all. It was a multi-state investigation, examining cell records, bank accounts, every social media profile she had. The FBI provided crucial technical and analytical assistance, which just shows how seriously this crime, based entirely on her testimony, was initially treated.
It really highlights the absolute responsibility law enforcement has to treat every victim's story as true at the outset, even when, some internal doubts might start to emerge. And that's exactly where we need to focus next.
This reliance on victim testimony, and it was coupled with the compelling physical injuries she displayed, that allowed the hoax to sustain itself for years. The injuries gave the lie a physical authenticity that superseded any logical inconsistencies.
So, as you mentioned, the physical injuries were compelling, but when seasoned professionals started compiling all the data, the narrative began to buckle under the weight of its own strangeness. Our sources confirmed that law enforcement experts cited unlikely details and inconsistencies almost immediately. What specific elements were raising those early doubts?
Well, there were several red flags that just didn't align with typical abduction cases. First, the captors being described as 2 armed Hispanic women with no clear motive, targeting a random jogger in a quiet neighborhood. It was just statistically very unusual.
It feels very specific, almost like a movie plot.
It does. And second, the location of her reappearance 150 miles south in Yola County. It suggested a massive movement over 3 weeks, yet she claimed she'd been kept in relatively contained conditions. It didn't quite add up.
And I think the most curious thing is why release her at all? Still wearing restraints hundreds of miles away on a major highway. If the capture wanted to eliminate evidence, this was a highly visible, high-risk release strategy that made very little sense from a criminal perspective.
Precisely. If the motive was ransom, no ransom was requested. If the motive was violence, why let her go? The entire logistical reality of the 2 women's story just felt manufactured, even if the physical evidence of her suffering was real.
And that forced investigators to look for the truth behind the injuries, rather than just accepting her explanation for them.
Which is where the critical piece of forensic evidence entered the picture, the DNA.
Right.
When she reappeared, forensic samples were, of course, collected, and investigators immediately found both male and female DNA on her body and on her clothing.
And critically, neither of these samples belonged to her or her husband, Keith.
Correct. Neither sample matched Papini or her husband. This created what they called the initial DNA puzzle.
So at first, this finding actually seemed to reinforce the abduction theory, right? It suggested she had contact with unknown individuals during those 3 weeks.
It did. The FBI immediately ran these samples through the combined DNA index system CODIS.
But the result was a dead end.
A complete dead end. At the time, the CODIS search yielded no matches. This meant that the DNA contributors, if they were her captors, were not individuals who had previously been convicted of serious enough crimes to have their profiles in the national database.
So that lack of a match just prolonged the investigation significantly. It allowed the theory of these unknown captors to persist for years.
It did. And while the investigators were struggling with this now cold case, Papini continued the deception. And this is where the case transitioned from a missing persons investigation into a sustained criminal fraud.
The sheer timeline of her continued lying is just astonishing. She stood by the abduction story for years.
For years, even when she was questioned directly by a federal agent and a detective from the Shasta County Sheriff's Office in August of 2020, that's nearly 4 years after the event, she maintained the fabricated narrative of the two women. She was deliberately, actively misleading federal agents.
And this sustained lie, it became the foundation for some severe financial fraud against the state of California.
Yes, and this is the element that transitioned the state's wasted investigative resources into formal fraud charges. Between 2017 and 2021, Papini successfully defrauded the California Victim Compensation Board. She received more than $30,000 in payouts.
Can you explain for our listener, how does this compensation process work? And what does it tell us about how sustained this fraud really was?
Of course. The Victim Compensation Board is designed to help actual victims recover from financial losses associated with a crime. Things like, therapy, medical bills, maybe temporary loss of income.
So it's not just a one-time payment.
Not at all. For Papini to receive $30,000 over 4 years, she had to submit continuous documented claims that required professional endorsement from doctors, therapists, and her own signed attestations, all affirming her status as a traumatized victim of a violent crime. It was a sustained deception that required her to repeatedly leverage her fabricated ordeal to get state resources that were meant for genuine victims.
So every claim she submitted, every piece of paperwork was another lie.
It was another act of fraud. The claims she made and the supporting documentation she provided proved she was actively and criminally monetizing her hoax over a prolonged period.
So the state wasn't just wasting money on the investigation. They were being actively defrauded through a prolonged, documented process involving sophisticated paperwork, all while she was insisting to federal agents the story was true.
Absolutely. The sustained nature of the fraud really highlights the commitment she had to maintaining this illusion of victimhood. The legal system allows for reasonable doubt, but it does not tolerate clear criminal deception against state funds.
But the case remained stalled.
It did. It was reliant entirely on that CODIS puzzle being solved.
And that DNA puzzle, after years of silence, was finally broken wide open, thanks to an evolution in forensic technology. So after 5 years of dead ends, the key to solving the entire case lay in that single, unidentified male DNA sample that was found on Papini's clothing. What was the technical advancement that allowed investigators to finally bypass the CODIS limitation and connect the dots?
The breakthrough, which came in March of 2022, was attributed to new forensic techniques, specifically the application of genetic genealogy and potentially familial searching. See, CODIS only works if the perpetrator has been arrested and entered into the system. Genetic genealogy, however, uses the DNA sample to build a family tree by cross-referencing public DNA databases, the kind of thing people use for ancestry research.
Right, that's the technique we hear about now that solves these decades-old cold cases. So instead of looking for a direct match, they were looking for a close relative.
Exactly. And this persistence allowed investigators to identify a relative of the male DNA donor. From there, they were able to zero in on the primary target, an ex-boyfriend of Sherri Papini named James Reyes.
And that was the pivotal moment. That shattered the two Hispanic women narrative forever.
Completely. Once he was identified, law enforcement confronted Reyes.
And what was his immediate response? How did his account contrast with Papini's?
Reyes cooperated fully, and his testimony confirmed the entire thing was a hoax. He told investigators that Papini had contacted him and voluntarily stayed with him at his Southern California residence during the entire 22 days she was reported missing.
Wow.
And crucially, his DNA was the male DNA found on her. Reyes' account proved that the disappearance was completely fabricated so she could spend time with him.
That revelation must have been explosive. The FBI moved quickly, arresting Sherri Papini on March 3, 2022.
The charges immediately reflected the severity and the scope of the deception. Lying to federal agents, which is a felony, and faking the kidnapping, which cost the public hundreds of thousands of dollars in wasted resources. That arrest was the culmination of years of quiet, persistent investigative work.
And the moment the truth emerged, the personal devastation was immediate and complete. We know that she and her husband, Keith Papini, they separated the very day of her arrest.
The collapse of her marriage was incredibly rapid. Keith Papini filed for divorce and sought sole custody of their children in April 2022, just days after Sherri Papini entered her guilty plea.
You have to imagine the trust, the years of public anguish he endured while defending her. It just dissolved instantly when he was confronted with the undeniable proof of her lie.
It did.
Let's talk about that admission. So 6 weeks after her arrest in April 2022, she signed a plea deal. What exactly did she admit to?
By signing that plea agreement, Papini formally admitted she orchestrated the entire hoax. She pleaded guilty to one count of making false statements for lying to the federal agents back in 2020, and one count of mail fraud, which was related to the $30,000 she received from the Victim Compensation Board.
And it's important to acknowledge the efficiency of that plea deal here.
Yeah.
I mean, she faced potentially decades of imprisonment, but by admitting guilt to the two key charges, 33 other counts of mail fraud were dropped.
Right. It cemented her legal responsibility while also streamlining the path to sentencing.
The legal machine then moved toward accountability and retribution.
It did. During her sentencing in September of 2022, her attorney focused on contextualizing her actions, citing past mental health issues as contributing factors to the profound deception. Papini herself offered an apology, stating that she accepted full responsibility for the immense pain and fraud she caused.
And the sentence was specific, it was severe, and most importantly, it was financially punitive. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release.
But the financial restitution component is perhaps the most staggering aspect of the judgment.
It is. The court ordered her to pay a total of $309,902 in restitution. And this figure wasn't arbitrary. It was a careful calculation of the extensive costs incurred by the multi-state police investigation her hoax prompted, combined with the fraudulent compensation she received. Can we break down that number, that $309,902? Where did that money specifically go? I think it really shows the scale of the state resources she wasted.
The sources indicate the restitution was meticulously detailed to cover governmental costs. Approximately $148,866 was allocated to the FBI.
Wow.
That covered the costs of forensic analysis, travel for agents across multiple states, surveillance, and hundreds of man-hours spent trying to track down the two Hispanic women.
So that's just the FBI's bill.
Just the FBI. The Shasta County Sheriff's Office also received compensation for their investigative time, evidence processing, and search efforts. Furthermore, $127,568 was ordered back to the California Victim Compensation Board, representing the state's payment for her medical expenses, therapy, and cash payouts based on the false claim.
So she had to repay every single dollar of the compensation she received, plus the direct investigative costs.
Every dollar. The remainder covered various other governmental agencies involved in the search and evidence processing. It was a complete accounting of the financial damage caused by her crime.
That just shows the profound economic impact of a sustained lie against the public trust.
And the message was clear. If a hoax of this magnitude requires such vast governmental resources, the perpetrator must bear the financial burden. So, following her time in custody, she was released in August of 2023 and placed in a halfway house, beginning her period of supervised release. The legal chapter may have been closed.
But the controversy surrounding the truth of her injuries was just beginning to intensify.
Right. Despite her guilty plea, the story didn't stabilize. The central question shifted from, was she kidnapped, to, did James Reyes abuse her? This reframing became the central conflict of the 2025 investigation discovery documentary Sherri Papini, Caught in the Lie.
And this documentary provided Papini's first post-conviction public interview, where she attempted to dramatically shift the narrative regarding the physical evidence that had initially convinced the world.
She did. She claimed that all her physical injuries, the bruises, the required medical attention, the waist chain, and crucially the brand on her shoulder, were inflicted non-consensually by James Reyes during those 3 weeks. She was essentially trying to reposition herself as a genuine victim, just a victim of Reyes rather than the two fictional women.
That seems like a really desperate attempt to explain away the visible evidence of trauma by just shifting the perpetrator, even though she had pleaded guilty to lying about the circumstances. How did James Reyes respond to this extremely serious, newly raised allegation?
Reyes vehemently denied the claim of non-consensual harm. His cooperation with law enforcement, which included providing DNA evidence and his testimony, had been instrumental in exposing the hoax.
Right, he was the key.
He was. And furthermore, he passed a law enforcement-administered polygraph test, which supported his claim that his involvement with her was voluntary.
So what was his version of the injuries? If the injuries were real, and we know they were, how did he explain the branding and the weight loss?
Reyes maintained that Papini had voluntarily stayed with him and that she orchestrated the injuries to make the return narrative convincing. He claimed she either inflicted some injuries herself or, and this is critical, she asked him to assist in creating others, including the branding.
So the implication is that the physical evidence of trauma was part of the stagecraft of this elaborate hoax.
Exactly.
So this presents an investigative dilemma. You have two conflicting accounts of the same physical injuries.
Huh?
Which narrative did the forensic evidence ultimately support?
The physical evidence overwhelmingly supported the conclusion that the injuries were controlled or self-inflicted. It backed Ray's testimony. Medical examiners and an FBI criminal analyst spent considerable time reviewing the evidence.
And what was their conclusion?
Their consensus was clear. The wounds were consistent with deliberate, self-inflicted or controlled injuries designed to create a visual impression of prolonged abuse, but lacking the critical defensive wounds and trauma patterns you would see with forced captivity.
That distinction, controlled versus forced, that's the key difference between theater and genuine violence. Can we elaborate on how forensic experts were able to make that kind of determination?
Well, in cases of genuine forced captivity and abuse, investigators look for specific patterns. Random violent trauma, defensive wounds that show resistance, and injuries to areas that are typically inaccessible to the victim. In Papini's case, the wounds, including the bruising and the cut hair, were determined to be too deliberate and too specific to be the result of a prolonged, forced struggle. For instance, the alleged bite marks she reported were analyzed by forensic experts and were actually determined to be rashes, not genuine bite injuries.
Wow. And the branding, the Exodus mark, that must have been subject to particularly intense scrutiny.
It was. The nature of the branding, which was a clear, controlled word, suggested an application process that was likely cooperative or self-administered, or at least performed under conditions where the subject remained still. It was inconsistent with branding performed on a struggling, non-consenting captive.
Which reinforces Reyes' claim that it was an act she requested or performed to make the ordeal look more authentic and symbolic.
It does. And in trying to understand why a person would inflict such trauma upon themselves and then construct such a massive lie around it, law enforcement uncovered some highly relevant context from her past. This historical behavior predated the 2016 hoax by many years.
Right. This is a crucial piece of the investigative file.
It is. In 2003, so 13 years before the abduction hoax, Papini's own mother filed a report with the Shasta County Sheriff's Office. This report specifically alleged that Papini had been harming herself and subsequently blaming those injuries on other people.
That 2003 report provides a powerful, if disturbing, pattern. It shows that Papini had a documented history of using self-inflicted injuries to create a false narrative of victimization years before she attempted it on a national stage.
It is the context that explains the investigative conclusion in 2016. When investigators were later presented with Papini's 2025 claims of non-consensual harm by Reyes, they could cross-reference this established 2003 pattern.
So this history provided a vital professional lens for them.
It did. It confirmed for the courts and for law enforcement that the physical evidence of trauma was likely the result of a deeply ingrained behavioral pattern rather than external victimization by captors.
And this context is absolutely essential for understanding the psychological drivers behind a crime that had such an enormous cultural and media footprint.
The need for such a massive investigative effort, and the reason the restitution was calculated to be over $300,000, is a direct consequence of the extraordinary media frenzy that the initial disappearance generated.
The media attention was just relentless and entirely sympathetic at the outset. National news outlets, including networks and major publications, they all descended on Redding. Papini was featured prominently in People magazine, and she quickly became known as the supermom survivor.
The public invested tremendous emotional energy into the search. The narrative of a beautiful, innocent mother snatched while jogging just resonated so profoundly. Massive reward funds were publicized, and the search became a national spectacle.
And when the hoax was revealed, the media coverage didn't diminish. It merely shifted from a true crime survival story to a true crime fraud scandal.
Right. The case was too sensational, too high profile to simply fade away. The coverage of the hoax confirmation, the arrest, and the sentencing was almost as extensive as the initial disappearance reporting. It spanned countless true crime documentaries, news magazine episodes, and deep dive analyses like this one.
And this notoriety basically guaranteed the story's passage into pop culture. We see this manifested in several adaptations and references over the subsequent years.
Absolutely.
First, the scripted adaptations. There was the 2023 Lifetime television film, Hoax, The Kidnapping of Sherri Papini. It's always interesting to see how dramatic license takes over. In that film, the lead detective was fictionalized and depicted as female, played by Lawson Chambers.
Which is a departure from the reality that the lead detective was Shasta County Sheriff Sergeant Kyle Wallace.
Right. And this quick dramatization just shows how rapidly a powerful, if false, narrative can be codified for entertainment, often simplifying the complex investigative work that was involved.
And beyond the scripted films, serious documentary series have dedicated extensive analysis to the case.
Yeah, we saw Hulu release the 2024 limited documentary series titled Perfect Wife, The Mysterious Disappearance of Sherri Papini, and of course the 2025 investigation discovery documentary, Sherri Papini, Caught in the Lie, which we discussed, and which provided the platform for her controversial and refuted claims against James Reyes.
And the case became so pervasive in the cultural lexicon that her name became shorthand for a fake disappearance. It even reached the music industry.
Yes, the unexpected mention came from the hip-hop artist Eminem, who referenced the kidnapping hoax in his song Houdini.
That's right. The line explicitly links Papini's deception to the idea of vanishing tricks. It's something like, caught sleeping and see the kidnapping never did happen. No, like Sherri Papini, Harry Houdini, I vanish into the thin air as I'm leaving, like.
That is a remarkable indicator of the story's integration into cultural awareness. When a specific, complex criminal case is reduced to a concise metaphor in popular music, it really confirms its status as a recognized cultural touchstone.
Absolutely. But this worldwide attention and cultural embedding, it had profound and lasting consequences for Papini post-release, even after serving her sentence and apologizing.
It did. During a 2025 interview, Papini admitted that she was facing immense difficulty finding legitimate employment. The global notoriety meant that any potential employer could instantly Google her name
And bring up the entire verified history of the hoax, the fraud, and the conviction. She noted that the worldwide attention the case received severely limited her options for reintegration and employment, effectively creating a permanent societal black mark.
So the consequences of this large-scale deception far outlast the 18 months in prison and the 3 years of supervised release. The debt of over $300,000 in restitution, the dissolution of her family, and the social stigma are permanent economic and personal realities tied directly to the media fame she engineered.
It serves as a powerful cautionary tale about the irreversible consequences of prioritizing a false narrative over reality, especially when state resources and public trust are involved.
Pull back and synthesize the key points of this remarkable case for the listener. The scale of the fabrication here required an intense emotional investment from the public, believing in the survival of the supermom. But the reality was a financial cost to the taxpayer exceeding $300,000 for the investigation. And that's compounded by the $30,000 she fraudulently received.
And, as we documented, this all resulted in the complete destruction of her personal life, the immediate divorce, the loss of custody, and the societal inability to successfully reintegrate. It illustrates how a lie, when it's perpetuated and sustained over years, can reach a point of just unstoppable self-destruction.
And when we connect the documented historical context, that 2003 report filed by her own mother regarding self-harm and blaming others to the final legal admission, it provides such a crucial lens.
It does. It helps us understand the complexity of intent. This was not a random lapse in judgment, but rather the execution of a historical behavioral pattern on a dramatically increased federal scale.
The long-term lie, involving the physical staging, the branding, and maintaining the narrative to federal agents 4 years later, that required a level of commitment that went beyond simple impulse.
It was criminal fraud built upon a deep, complex psychological foundation, which her attorney, rightly brought up during sentencing.
This ultimately brings us back to the inherent challenge for investigators and the legal system. How do you legally and ethically justify doubting a victim who presents with compelling, genuine physical injuries?
And that is the crux of the investigative difficulty. The justice system is built to protect the vulnerable. The Papini case forces us to confront the ethical and practical difficulties inherent in investigating cases where the physical evidence, the injuries, the restraints, the branding, is actively and deliberately manipulated by the very person claiming victimhood.
And it diverts resources and public sympathy away from genuine victims of crime.
It does. When the source of the story has a documented history of blurring the line between self-inflicted pain and alleged external use, the job of the investigator becomes exponentially harder. It requires immense forensic patience to discern control from compulsion and theatrical staging from actual captivity.
And that is the question we leave you to reflect upon. What are the necessary safeguards, both legal and forensic, that must be employed to effectively and fairly investigate cases where physical evidence is actively and expertly used to fabricate a crime? How do we protect genuine victims while effectively prosecuting those who exploit systems designed for protection.
Mm.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Sherri Papini case, its complex trajectory, and the profound legal and personal consequences of this internationally publicized deception. We hope this analysis provides you with a comprehensive and verified understanding of the facts.